Thanks everybody for attending. We're going to talk a little bit today about how to go through and migrate and manage workloads in AWS. Give you a little background. FuseForward is a AWS advanced technology partner. We are providing and managing various workloads inside AWS and have experience, over 10 years experience working in the cloud, and over 5 years experience plus working specifically scaling out and managing complex workloads in AWS itself. Today what we're going to talk about is give you a little bit of how we go through and look at readiness of organizations for migrating to the cloud. Our process of provision, configure, and automate, the things that you need to do as we're walking through that. We're going to talk a little bit about managing your cloud environment once you've actually gone through and migrate your applications, and then come up and share with you how you can go and get rolling and or use the cloud as part of your IT infrastructure in the future. So as I shared already, FuseForward is an AWS technology partner. We have been managing IT environments for application workloads, and we have over 25 years experience managing large complex IT systems. We've worked with major transportation agencies throughout North America and Europe, and global facility management companies and various public sector agencies. So our experience in the cloud is not one of strictly looking at single applications and small business deployments. What we basically have a strong understanding of how to do is handle complex, highly secure workloads. Think of this like water utilities, electric utilities, and facilities that need to leverage the capabilities of the cloud to manage their workloads, but need to do it in a secure manner. And that's what I'm going to share with you today, is some of the things that we need to look at in that vein. So let's talk a little bit about current IT challenges. What is driving the need to move to the cloud? So a lot of people right now in the IT world are looking at cost containment. They have large data centers where basically they've been deploying lots of virtual servers, and during this process, they're usually into an upgrade cycle. How do we go through and upgrade our current hardware? And during that question of migrations of data centers, they're then saying, should we be looking at migrating towards the cloud environment as opposed to investing in hardware themselves? So that's one of the big drivers. Another big driver that comes along is the application upgrades. So if you look at your large ERP applications, your work order management systems, or your SCADA systems, we're always implementing and upgrading applications. We go through major upgrades. A major application upgrade in some cases can be multi-million dollars. And basically when you're looking at that, it gives you an opportunity to look at modernizing it, putting in a new container-based structure on it, and or optimizing the infrastructure in which it's going. Additional challenges, of course, is how do we go through and deal with the concept of the digital transformation. Digital transformation is where organizations are looking at leveraging the cloud to deliver new services to their customers. That's driving things like optimizing cost base, providing and linking the IT spend with the actual revenues that the business is actually driving or that they're receiving. With that, in some of the environments we work in, there is a strong need for regulatory compliance and security. We're continually hearing issues that different organizations are being breached. Cybersecurity is a big issue, whether that's in the cloud or whether that's with data center on-premise deployments. Security and regulatory compliance are always still a need. So if you think about this, there's a lot of colliding forces that an IT shop is dealing with. They're usually looking for a service provider to help them, or they're looking to do it themselves and try and get the benefits of the cloud and migrate some applications in a manner to see if they can basically manage their costs and improve their service delivery to their customers. So how can we go through then and leverage some of the benefits of the cloud? So we basically go through a three-step process here. So the first step that we have is to basically assess the environments today, assess the application portfolio, and we will talk through each one of these in more detail. The second step is basically provision, configure, and automate an application, a portfolio of applications, or the whole IT organization. And then the third step in this process is once you've gone through that provision, configure, and automate step for an application, how do we monitor it, manage it, and optimize its utilization of its resources, and how do we optimize the performance of the application using the ability and the levers available for us in the cloud. All right, readiness assessment. So if we've got a bunch of IT folks here, we also know that There is usually an IT strategy, and a number of the organizations in the world today are actually driving what they call a cloud-first strategy. A cloud-first strategy says that any new applications that we deploy will be deployed in the cloud first, and that means that we're also trying to go through and migrate our applications to the cloud. The challenge, of course, is when you've got a large portfolio or even a mid-sized business with 3 to 5 applications or a large organization with hundreds or thousands, how do I go through and get myself ready to go through and do that? What are the things I need to consider, and what are the steps do I need to take? So let's look at that. So some of the things that you want to do during a readiness assessment. You want to inventory your applications. What does that mean? It means get a complete list of your applications. When was it built? What technology is it built in? Is it a mission critical application? Is it a departmental application? Is it a silo application? What are some of the quick wins that can be found in that application? What are the high valued applications that should move first? Which ones can come later? And then, of course, once you've identified what your applications are and you've got some of your quick wins, can I identify a specific set of applications and start the provision, configure, and automate process for that specific app? So let's look at some of the things that we want to consider in doing this. So if you're looking at an inventory of your applications, there's 5 key areas that you want to look at. What is the application? What kind of application is it? So as an example, legacy systems like packaged applications like SAP or Oracle Financials, PeopleSoft, etc., they all come with the capability of a set of virtual CDs, remember the worlds of CDs, and we basically use that as code packages where we actually go through and build applications. Or the application might be a homegrown application with its own code written and stored in a code repository. Or it could be a modern application that uses containers and microservices. In all cases, we're looking at what kind is it. Part of that dictates what infrastructure you need to deploy it on. So then we go into the next question. What's the deployment model you need to follow? So if you're dealing with a packaged application, you may be dealing with a build the application, prepare a configuration, and then basically deploy the binaries and manage a binary deployment process using a controlled release management process because it's a high mission critical application and we're not allowed to do continuous delivery. Or let's say you're somebody like Netflix or you're some other large SaaS-based company. You may be using a continuous delivery model where you're actually continuing to go through and deploy new functionality into your production environment as it becomes available, more of a CI and CD process. So each one of those deployment models dictates a different kind of deployment framework in which you want to configure up the cloud environment to handle. Third question, how secure does it need to be? Is this application something that should never hit the internet? Is this application a mission critical system that should be plugged in with private network connections into your plant operations so that you still have capabilities of doing that? From the security, making sure that you have multi-levels of connectivity options already available and you have full failover. Or is this an application which is a small departmental application and it just needs to be locked down and you're going to have users accessing it through a browser? Fourth question, how do you build the system? So is the build process one of going through and building it with a set of components? Are you going to be deploying the code packages onto different cluster nodes? Or is it one where you build once and you have to deploy manually into all the different environments? And of course, the last question, but by no means the least, what are the application performance needs? So the things that we look at during that are, how many users does it have? Are there a lot of integration points into the application? What kind of data volumes is it generating from a reporting context? Is it got a lot of user interaction? Each one of those questions define an application load profile. From that application load profile, it helps to actually feed back into the other questions, which is, how do we want to now think about our provisioning specification and our deployment model? Do we want a single server deployment? Do we want a cluster deployment? Do we want to put all the different code packages on multiple servers, or do we want to create clusters of specific capabilities in a containerized model? A lot of different considerations that we would want to take place. So once we've gone through and we've done our readiness assessment, we basically have chosen an application. Now, let's say that application might be a business application with a lot of users and 1 or 2 integration points. And we're basically going to go through and say, all right, now what am I going to do during the provisioning step to determine how I'm going to take that application and now use it in the cloud? So let's go through and look at that and some of the things we need to consider. What are you trying to accomplish? So for provisioning, one of the things in the cloud that we have is we have the ability to, instead of trying to build and overbuild the application infrastructure for peak load, we have the ability to go through and create a scalable infrastructure. What does this mean? Instead of going through and creating a single large, say, Sun Systems, the old legacy Sun Systems servers that would handle the maximum capacity at any one point in time in the year, we can instead go through and create smaller server infrastructure, virtual in this case, and be able to only burst that infrastructure when we need that load. So that's part of what we're looking at in the way of optimizing our resource usage. So if you go back to what we did during our assessment, we would have gone through and identified already what the structure and the deployment model is for the application. From this, we'd be looking at the application performance requirements. So those are things like, I need to be able to handle 1,000 users, but I need to be able to handle 1,000 users logging in between 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock every morning. But I need to be able to handle reporting jobs that are happening in the middle of the night that are going to create large data sets. I'm going to be able to handle integration jobs that might be running at a different time, and I also need to be able to do my database backups at a certain time during the day when I don't have my user performance going on. So part of what we're doing when we're looking at resource usage, we're looking at those different ups and downs, and from that, we're designing and trying to design a secure and scalable application environment. Part of what that drives when we start looking at those application operating environments, it then defines for us how many servers we need, what size servers we should be looking at, where the data stores need to be, and what kind of load balancers we need to put in place in order to go through and burst up and burst down the resource usage. So let's go through and look at some additional things and the key considerations that we have when we're now provisioning up in the environments. So during our assessment, we may have deployed and created a deployment environment that said, in our production environment, because this is a mission critical application, we want a multi-data center, multi-region, highly available infrastructure so that it has full disaster recovery built in, and we're clustering the servers across it. But when we look at that, that says, how many environments do we need? Do we need the environments for our development and our test and our production environments to all have that same level of failover? Probably not, because what we'd be doing is when we start looking at development environments, we're actually dealing more with just developing code packages. We're not looking at running the code packages in a scale-out model. So what we may want to do here is look at the environments and say, it's a very small departmental application. Maybe we only need a development environment and a production environment. But if we're dealing with an enterprise-grade application, we may need a development environment, a data environment, a training environment, a testing environment, an acceptance testing environment, a pre-prod environment for performance tuning and staging, as well as a production environment. 5, 6, 7 different environments. Now, the question that comes along when we start looking at those environments is, who needs access to them? So as an example, things like the development environment, we may need our developers accessing it. But do we want our developers to access our production environment? Typically not. Typically, the production environment would be managed by a release management team and the operations team that hardens up that environment. So how can we segregate out our different environments with different security rights around all of that? So that's part of the needs that we deal with as we're provisioning these environments and what we provide in the way of privileged user access. The other question comes in is, what are the application configurations that you need in the different environments? So as an example, in the development environment, we may not need to have all the integrations with all the other systems. But when we start driving into the testing environment, we want to do some smoke testing around the integration. So how do we go through and create those different environments with different integration points and different capabilities? And hence what that's going to drive us is it's going to drive us to the different things we need in the way of network connectivity and network configurations and network routing rules. And of course, by no least, one of the most difficult ones to answer is, how are we going to do release management? So release management is, how do we move from development to test to pre-production to production? And as we go through that process, are we automating the process from development to test to pre-prod? Or are we doing it as more of a manual process depending upon the application? So part of that is how much can we even, if we do have a manual process, can we still build automation, but basically trigger the automation through a process that leverages and controls our release management processes based upon our security compliance requirements? Okay, so that's the provisioning step. Let's go through now and look at the configuration step. So configuration is not a simple exercise. If you look at an application, it can have hundreds to thousands of configuration parameters. And part of that is not only that, but within the actual cloud infrastructure itself, there's all kinds of different components that we look at as well in the way of the configurations that you can do as well. So let's go through and look at some of the key considerations and some of the things that you want to take into consideration on this. So what are we trying to accomplish with configuration? So our approach to going through and doing this, and this is some of the things that we've pioneered, is the ability to go through and create what we call configuration templates and design and configuration patterns. So what do we mean when we say that? So we have a whole patent approach that we've taken to go through and identify how to take a complex system and boil it down into a manufactured or a pre-configuration approach. So what does that do? You take an application or you take the infrastructure, and what we start to do is we create deployment patterns and configuration patterns. So a configuration pattern for something like an SAP or an Oracle Financials would go through, and we break that apart into 3 different configurations. What is the infrastructure and the middleware configurations that we need to basically standardize on? What is the application technical configuration? And what is the business application configuration? When we look at migrating an application to the cloud, the first 2 are the key ones that you want to be concerned about. Concern is the first one, which is how do I standardize my cloud infrastructure and middleware configuration? So that means things like your middleware. It means things like the size of servers for the cloud nodes, the deployment patterns for deploying JVMs on the different nodes, or deploying and configuring up your IIS infrastructure, or your Tomcat, WebSphere, or your JBoss infrastructure for your middleware. It could even mean, how do I go through for a containerized application and create a standardized configuration model for how I'm going to deploy containers across all my different hosts? So that's the key one. We basically use a series of about 6 different configuration patterns, everything from standalone single server active cold standby to multi-clustered, multi-region deployment configurations. Okay? Let's go through step number 2, or the other things to consider, okay, is how do we capture all the configuration items and rules? So what's a configuration item? If you're familiar with ITIL, you'll know that what you're trying to do is every time that I change a configuration, I want to go through and capture the time and date on which I made that configuration change. So part of that is not trying to get down to or is trying to be able to go through and track and monitor and manage the right types of configuration items. Third part that we start looking at is with the configuration items and rules defined, we can start going through and optimizing the configuration of the resources. We can start saying, well, do I need to build really large nodes for a clustered environment, or can I use smaller nodes with smaller workloads and be able to deploy it across multiple regions and multiple server infrastructure? And from that, it actually helps us optimize how many servers we need, when we burst them up, when we burst them down, turn on, turn off, and all the other components required for that. And that gets us into the last, which is defining your application configuration parameters and relationships. So as an example, one of the things we look at when we deal with technical application configuration is we take all the parameters that we look at, and we work with our customers in different application workloads, and we say, what are we looking at? Do we have primary indicators, primary configuration parameters that drive application performance? Then there's secondary configuration parameters that more affect its ability to operate or not. And then the third are tertiary indicator, or tertiary parameters. And they may be ones that are basically our turn on and turn off that basically just affect the functionality and whether the application is running the way we want it to run. So key considerations then, when you're looking at all those items and you're trying to understand how you're going to configure the system and create a configuration standard, one of the things you want to understand is what level of ITIL alignment do you need to have. So ITIL is the information technology information lifecycle. So part of that we look at is how are you doing release management? How are you going to manage change and changes inside the different environments from development to test to production? How are we going to go through and manage that release process, but then also how are we going to go through and deal with incident management and be able to look for all the configuration items? Then that drives us into a little bit of what then level of detail do I need in my configuration items? Is the middleware application server infrastructure part of my configuration items? Or is it just the server host that I'm monitoring and managing as a configuration item? That is driven a little bit by the type of code packages and whether it's a custom built application or whether it's a packaged application. And part of all of this stuff is when you're going through this whole configuration process, the key thing you want to take into consideration is the people working on the project are not typically the same people that are operating and managing the application once it goes into production. So as you're going through and provisioning it, the key thing and configuring it, the key thing you want to be looking at is documenting and creating all of that content to allow an operator or an application manager to be able to go through and troubleshoot, monitor, and optimize the system when it gets handed over to the operations team. So that gets us into the piece that I always get excited about, which is automation. Because the one part that really gets us with cloud is that almost everything that I've shared with you right now is things that we have probably done in the past in the way of provisioning and configuring applications in a physical hardware or data center environment, but it's all best practice. We probably may know that already. But the automation side is where the cloud shines. Okay, well, let's go through and look at a little bit of what we can do with the cloud now that would automate the processes and also give us more resiliency and scalability and hence cost savings in the cloud. Okay, so what are we trying to accomplish with automation? Well, the big part about cloud is that we have the ability to turn on, turn off servers and pay per minute, per hour, per day, per month. So we don't need to create steady state workloads. For everything, we could create a steady state workload for the lowest usage and burst up and burst down different capabilities of the systems. Especially in these new microservices and container-based deployments, we have a significant amount of capability to burst up even for an application. Say we want to go through and an application is going to be having a field user. And during the day, we have 1,000 field users. And then during Christmas, we have 1 million customers. What we can be doing is break apart our application where, depending upon the time of year, time of day, type of user, we can burst up different components of the application in an auto-scaling model. We can even go through and put triggers on this so the system is actually monitoring the usage patterns, are starting to see the scaling going up and can automatically scale up resources and then scale down resources as the demand drops. So think of, in the United States, Black Friday. Black Friday is one of the best sales days after Thanksgiving in America. And all of those retailers need to burst up all of their online shopping systems to handle the load. Okay? So part of that then is, how do we also go through, if we've got that capability of doing scaling up and scaling down on resource, we can also leverage that same capability to do disaster recovery. So what does that mean? It basically means if I've got a mission critical application and I have a hot standby in another region, in AWS, it could be going from, say, Northern Virginia and being able to go through and have a failover environment in Northern California. So as the hurricane comes up and takes out Virginia's data center, we can fail over everything to the California data center where the weather is sunny. And all of a sudden, we have a high availability environment across multiple regions in the United States. We can automate all of that stuff with the disaster recovery and with monitoring. So we start seeing fail points in certain regions, we can basically be shifting the load over to the other regions for a disaster recovery service. Part of that also gives us the ability to replicate systems for testing and backup. So if we look at it again with that multi-region capability, we could go through and say, we want to replicate testing and we're going to go and grow our business. We're going to enter into a new region. We're going to basically take our North American systems, we're going to deploy it in East Asia, in Asia, and we're going to go through and say, can I now go through and create a complete mirror of my environment in Asia? And can I now go through and run those applications there and deal with the latency and have local copies of the systems there to be able to run in the same way that we have them in North America? All of that can be done with automation. So if we've gone through the steps of provision and configure, we've captured everything using standard design templates and patterns. The automation steps using a tooling environment allow us to scale up and scale down the environments on resource use, but they will also allow us to go through and start handling disaster recovery. So when we go through and now start looking at this automation, what do we need to basically make sure we have? So one of the key skills that we always are looking at right now is, do we have the right skills, tools, and templates? What do we mean? So part of the key things right now is somebody like a DevOps developer is a different type of a coder than somebody that's basically going to go through and build your next software mobile application. A DevOps engineer uses a lot more scripting tools. They would be using tools like Ansible, like Terraform, okay, like Chef, like Puppet. But those are different tools with different mechanisms in place. Chef and Puppet, as an example, are a pull model, whereas Ansible is a push model into production. Which tool is the right for you to use? What are the templates then? As you've created these different tools and you've got some skills, what templates are you creating so that they're reusable automation templates? And as you create automation templates, you're able to go through and automate the process of deployments over and over again. Second one, are you doing continuous deployments? So I mentioned the concept of Netflix and other types of SaaS providers that want to continuously deploy new features and functions into production. Well, if you're doing that as continuous integration using Chef or Puppet, the question is going to come to is, how are you going through and controlling that and rolling that across all your different instances? It becomes a highly complex environment. You can't do that by hand. It all has to be done with an automation technique, okay? So third one is then if you are doing that, what are you going to do with the automation to make sure that you're managing your compliance requirements for production deployments? So as I suggested, Chef and Puppet is more of a pull model. Ansible is more of a push model. If we look at that, if we're trying to maintain SOC compliance in a production environment and we have security requirements for our large organization, we don't want to be using any sort of pull model into production. We want to control the release structures that go into the production deployments. So that comes into a little bit of making sure that our tools are aligning with our compliance requirements. And of course then, what about code repositories and version control? One of the key things that comes along with compliance requirements and automation, as we go through and do automation, we want to do automated builds. Automated builds, especially in a container environment, are best done with code repositories and Git repositories. Okay, so we've got GitHub, we've got Bitbucket, we've got a whole bunch of different repositories. All of them have the ability to plug into our automation tooling to go through and do automated builds of all of those code packages. So those are basically the whole process. What I've just gone through is the 3 steps of provision, configure, and automate for an application. Now that we've got this and we've got this application configured, it's ready to automate up and down, now we go into the manage stage. So now we've got this application running, how do we manage it? So the things that we always want to look at when we're trying to manage workloads in AWS, well, I always look at it from a business perspective. What are the service level requirements that we're trying to meet? If we are an application manager, we're typically inside an IT shop, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to align ourselves to our business objectives, which basically means how we're going to keep systems up and operational. How do you do your monitoring and configuration changes? How are we managing releases? How are we managing scaling? And what is the business continuity and disaster recovery requirements of our business? So all of these questions are drivers really that should be given in context and in partnership with our business users. If we can answer these and we're working to comply with our business compliance requirements, we can then make sure that our IT infrastructure is aligning and providing value to our business. Which then drives us to one of the number one first questions that I always bring forward when I'm talking to my IT customers. And I talk to the business customers and the CEOs of these large organizations. The question always comes down to is, what is the key business metrics that you are trying to drive? Is it cost reduction in a utility? Is it trying to make sure that the systems are always working and you have access to power and water? Is it increasing your top line revenue yield? Is it making sure that your customers are able to purchase on your online store at any point in time and that they're basically generating a lot more transactions because the response is really key? With all of those key questions then, once we have those business metrics, we can correlate those ones down into what monitoring metrics we need to capture from an IT perspective. So that means application uptime. It means things like how many transactions are we processing in the way of purchase orders, service orders, customer requests, and how many is the system able to track based upon those business drivers and those business cycles. Once we know those and we can link those monitoring metrics together, we can start reporting not only our application monitoring metrics, but also the business monitoring metrics. And that gets us into then, what service data do we need to capture? So when we think about monitoring and managing application workload, it's not good enough to go and look at it and just say, I'm going to pull data from the CPU utilization, RAM utilization, and network costs. That doesn't really give us anything, doesn't give us enough on what we're trying to capture related to whether we're linking to the business metrics. The things that we do need to capture are things like, how many purchase orders did we process in the application? How many service requests did we capture? All that is in business data that we can capture in an analytics environment and be able to correlate it with our monitoring data from the application, i.e. CPU utilization, RAM utilization, network traffic. Okay? Key thing to all of this stuff, again, is, and how long do we need to maintain that? We've got clients that have to keep data for 10 years for regulatory compliance. That's a lot of raw data. But do they really need the raw data, or do they need the event data? So we always go through and work with it to go through and try and do that. And then the question, the last one, of course, is how frequently do we need to capture this? If it's a departmental application, we may only need to capture this data every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes. But if it's a mission critical application, we may want to be capturing it every minute or every second. That drives a lot of data to be captured, but we may not need to keep all of that raw data forever. So I've given you a lot of information here, hopefully not too much of an overload, but let's go through a little bit of how we approach this. So fuse forward, what we've done is we've got a lot of experience going through and building these loads, managing these application workloads in AWS. So part of what we try to drive is we built a set of tools, Fuse Secure, Fuse Control, and Fuse Analyze, that help you manage that whole cycle of provision, configure, and automate, coupled with the management function. So it uses a data services and integration to ingest data from all of the different points in the logging environments. It uses a security product to manage and basically ensure that your application workload is locked down. It also has a control environment to go through and monitor and use templates to actually allow you to deploy these applications and the provisioning of the applications in a proven and battle-proof environment. It simplifies the model and allows you to go through and decrease your operational complexity. We provide it as a fully managed service. We work with IT shops, teach them how to use it. We will also work with systems integrators, and we work with other sorts of providers in order to go through and help them layer and manage those environments themselves. Ours is one of a partnering approach to actually help our customers go through and leverage the benefits of the cloud. So let's go through and just summarize a little bit of next steps here, and then I'll open this up for questions. Just to reiterate, when you're going through and doing the initial assessment, key things you want to ask. What kind of applications are you using? Are they containerized, mission critical, Java-based, legacy, packaged applications? What deployment model do you need for each one? Is it going to be highly available, active, passive, multi-region? How secure does it need to be? Does it need to have a high level of security encryption? Does it contain top secret data? How do you build the system? Is it using packaged software from CDs, or is it all custom built? And then what are the application performance needs? Is it a steady state workload where everybody's using it every day? Or does it burst at the end of the year when we have a lot of people buying on Black Sunday on Black Friday? Or are we going through and creating a mixed performance model where there's a lot of variability to it and we need to be dynamic in our burst up and burst down? A lot of questions to answer, but it's a very structured process if you follow the steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So to wrap up, we're quite happy to go through and we're excited to go and try and work with customers to help them go through and do an initial application readiness assessment, help them gain the benefits of the cloud. If you do, feel free to reach out, and we have an ability to go through, and we'll be happy to have some of our solution architects work with you on analyzing some of your application readiness for the cloud. Thank you. Any questions now?
It looks like we have a question here. So what kinds of older apps in our in-house server rooms are good kinds of apps to start with in bringing to the cloud? Do you have any answers for that, Mark?
So some of the kinds of apps that make sense are some of the first apps that you look at. You may think a small departmental application is the first one to drive. Probably not a good example. And the reason for that is it doesn't have enough users with variability of load to get the return on investment from a cloud deployment. But every application can be deployed in the cloud, but we start looking with an application that has the ability to take a big application and split it apart into different workloads that can be deployed on different servers. That is a great application to start with in the cloud.
How would you prioritize which applications you should move to the cloud?
So I think I shared that a little bit on the prioritization model. So prioritization is one of, if it's a really simple application, should it be first? It may be first in the way of testing and learning new skills, but it may not get the benefits of the return on investment that you have for investing in the cloud. One that, just as I shared earlier, that has more of a breakdown is a good one. You may not want to start also with a brand new containerized deployment of an application because it is highly complex if you're basically rebuilding it. But if you've got a project where you're actually building a new system from scratch, you may want to leverage and do a cloud native application. What does that mean? More of a containerized deployment with a smaller subsegment where you can actually get into a more frequent release cycle and use more of a CI and CD approach.
Okay, another question that's in here. What are strategies available to migrate our existing large data sets as well as secure user info to the cloud?
What are the, sorry, can you read?
Yeah, sorry. So strategies available to migrate existing large data sets as well as secure user info.
So the large data sets and the secure user info, if we start looking at what is available, there's a couple of approaches to do this. One of the key things when you're dealing with security data or any sort of large data sets is, can I migrate it all? You probably do not want to go and migrate all of that over the public internet. What you're going to want to be looking at is things like a private network connection that you can leverage in order to get that data in. Even in AWS, we have different capabilities where we can basically leverage a private network device that we can provide on premise, load up large terabytes of data sets, and securely send that off and load it up through the back door at AWS itself and plug it in and then bring it into our environments. That's one area. The other part we do is we do use different direct connects and we use private security environments in order to go through and bring those data sets across. Okay.
Great. More questions are coming in. Who is responsible for the testing of the environment once the initial migration is done?
So testing is one where we always look, and one of the key things you want to be looking at is no different from every other testing, is looking at an acceptance testing process with the end users, looking at an integration testing process with an integration testing team, as well as working backwards and making sure that we've got a functional or a technical configuration and that everything in the environment works. And I've kind of worked that from the top down. When you typically go through, the steps is to deploy, provision, and configure the environment, make sure the end-to-end environment is all working from a full end-to-end testing approach, and then migrating up to the point before you turn on the system and move it over, that the users have gone through an acceptance testing process and that we're actually able now to go through and provide the users with the confidence that this thing is ready to go.
Excellent. So just going to put it out there, if there's any more questions, feel free to submit them now. Here's another one. Oh, there's a lot more here, actually. Which other public cloud providers other than AWS are supported? Is it possible to have cloud agnostic or multi-cloud deployments?
So if we look at everything that we've just described, we've described this within the context of AWS. However, everything that we've just described also applies to Azure and any other cloud provider. Primarily the ones that have the largest capabilities of automation capabilities to leverage. Some of the cloud providers in the market today, and I'm not going to name which ones, are more of just your traditional metal with a virtualization environment on them without that same level of scalability and configurability on top that we find from AWS and secondarily from Microsoft. So can you go through and do that in a cloud agnostic or a multi-cloud deployment model? Yes, you can. So what you can do is, and that is one of the strategies that people are looking at. So we look at it and say, can I go through and leverage, say, an AWS environment and create a failover environment in an Azure? Yes, you can. And it comes down to, if you're using some third-party tools on top of each one of those environments, and you're using a common infrastructure, as an example, a containerized deployment can deploy in containers in AWS or in containers in Azure. And you can now start looking at a multi-container or a multi-cloud deployment model. Those are all feasible in this. Is it a little bit more complicated and complex? Yes, it is. Okay, and what you still want to consider when you're bringing those different multi-cloud strategies together is, instead of connecting them and doing all of that work using the public internet, how can you use private network connections and cloud exchanges, things that we do today, to plug these environments together using private networks as opposed to public networks.
Great. And I think that's everything. I'm just going to move on to our next slide. So just a reminder, if you were interested in the free readiness assessment, you can click the green box beneath the screen, or Wyatt has posted a link in the chat there. So there's two options for you to click through. So I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar. If you'd like to stay in touch with us, we do these events from time to time. We also share interesting content through our blog and our social channels. So our contact details are here on the screen. You can follow us on Twitter @FuseForward or on LinkedIn. So yeah, thank you again. So we have recorded this session and we'll be sending it out to everyone that's attended. And if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you.